The year was 1950, a simpler time, many would say, when children played hopscotch on sidewalks instead of staring at screens, when families gathered around radios for entertainment rather than television sets, when small towns like Milbrook still held onto their secrets, when the war was still fresh in everyone's minds, but life was moving forward with a tentative optimism that perhaps the worst was behind them. My grandmother kept this photograph hidden in the bottom drawer of her dresser, wrapped in tissue paper, as if she feared what might happen if it caught the light for too long. I found it after she passed away last month, while clearing out her home. 28 smiling faces, neatly dressed in their school uniforms. 28 children from Mrs. Eleanor Parker's 5th grade class at Milbrook Elementary School. 28 lives full of potential, with futures stretched out before them like an endless horizon. The photograph itself was slightly yellowed at the edges, but the image remained clear. May 15, 1950, written in careful cursive on the back. The children stood in 3 neat rows, the tallest at the back, the smallest in front, with Mrs. Parker standing to the side, her hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy with a cowlick that refused to stay down no matter how much Brill cream his mother had applied that morning. When I showed this photograph to my mother, the color drained from her face. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands trembled as she took it from me, her fingertips barely touching the edges as if it might burn her. She told me to put it away, to forget I had ever seen it, but I couldn't. There was something about those children's eyes that held me, something in their smiles that seemed both innocent and knowing, a collective secret shared among them, preserved in silver halide for over 7 decades. My grandmother was one of these children. 3rd row, second from the left. Dorothy Miller back then, before she married my grandfather. Her dark hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, tied with ribbons that matched her carefully pressed dress. Her smile was slight, almost tentative, as if she wasn't quite sure she belonged in the photograph. She rarely spoke about her childhood, and when she did, she never mentioned her elementary school days. Now I understand why. Some memories are too heavy to carry into conversation, too painful to reshape into anecdotes for family gatherings. Milbrook was a mining town back then. The coal mine employed most of the men, including my great-grandfather. The town prospered as America rebuilt after the war. New houses went up, businesses opened on Main Street, and families grew. The elementary school had to add a new wing just to accommodate all the children. The baby boom was in full swing, filling classrooms to capacity with the children of returning soldiers and their relieved wives. The town itself was nestled in a valley, surrounded by gentle hills that turned a vibrant green in spring and a kaleidoscope of reds and oranges in fall. The mine entrance was set into the largest of these hills, a dark mouth that swallowed men each morning and spat them back out each evening, their faces blackened with coal dust, their lungs slowly filling with the same substance that paid for their children's clothes and food. Main Street was the heart of Milbrook, lined with shops that sold everything from penny candy to fine china. Thornton's General Store anchored one end, with its creaky wooden floors and glass jars of colorful sweets that children pressed their noses against after school. Henderson's Pharmacy stood at the other end, with its soda fountain where teenagers gathered on Saturday afternoons to share milkshakes and whispered confidences. Between them stretched the everyday life of a town that believed it knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. Mrs. Parker was new to town that year, having moved from somewhere back east after losing her husband in the war. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with a reputation for being strict but fair. The children admired her elegant dresses and the way she wrote in perfect cursive on the blackboard. She wore her golden hair in a neat twist at the nape of her neck, and a small heart-shaped locket that she often touched absently while lost in thought. The locket, rumors said, contained a photograph of the husband she had lost at Normandy. Unlike most of the teachers at Milbrook Elementary, who had taught there for decades and remembered teaching the parents of their current students, Mrs. Parker brought new ideas and methods. She read poetry to the class after lunch. She organized debates on current events. She believed that education should extend beyond the classroom walls, which is why she often took the children on educational walks around town, pointing out architectural details or historical landmarks that the children had passed 1,000 times without noticing. May 15th was picture day at Milbrook Elementary. The children wore their best clothes and combed their hair. Boys who normally raced through the halls with untucked shirts and scuffed shoes stood still as their mothers straightened their collars and slicked down cowlicks with water and determination. Girls who typically played as roughly as their brothers sat patiently as mothers wove ribbons through their braids or curled their hair with rags overnight. Mrs. Parker made sure every collar was straight, every bow was tied properly before they lined up outside for the photographer. The photographer was Mr. Caldwell from the next town over, who traveled between schools with his bulky camera and portable backdrop. He had been taking school photographs for 30 years and had a reputation for capturing even the most fidgety children at their best. "Smile like you've got a secret," he always told them, which invariably produced genuine smiles rather than the stiff, uncomfortable grins that most photographers elicited. The day was unusually warm for May, my mother told me. The kind of spring day that feels like summer, with a clear blue sky and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of lilacs from the bushes that grew along the school fence. The sort of day that makes it impossible to concentrate on fractions or grammar when sunshine and freedom beckon from beyond classroom windows. The lilacs had bloomed early that year, their purple clusters heavy with fragrance, attracting bees that bumbled lazily from flower to flower as the children lined up for their photograph. The photograph was taken just before lunch. Afterward, Mrs. Parker announced a special treat. Instead of regular lessons that afternoon, they would go on a nature walk to celebrate the beautiful weather. The children were ecstatic, chattering excitedly as they grabbed their lunch pails. In 1950, an unexpected afternoon outdoors was the equivalent of finding an extra Christmas present with your name on it, an unexpected joy that illuminated an ordinary day. They ate lunch on the playground, sitting in small groups on the grass, trading sandwich halves and comparing desserts. Chocolate pudding cups were the prized possession that day, my mother said. Betty Harper had 3 of them in her lunch, which caused quite a stir among the other children. Her father worked for the pudding company in the next town over, and often brought home extras that couldn't be sold because of dented containers or misapplied labels. Betty was generous with her bounty, breaking open the wax paper seals and letting her friends dip their spoons in for a taste of the rich, sweet pudding that was still a luxury for many families in those post-war years. The spring air was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the metallic clicks of lunchboxes opening and closing, and the distant call of meadowlarks from the fields beyond the schoolyard. Johnny Peterson's new transistor radio, a birthday gift from an uncle in Chicago, played softly in the background, the latest hit from Nat King Cole drifting across the playground, mixing with the more traditional sounds of childhood. After lunch, Mrs. Parker lined them up again, this time for their nature walk. They would be going to Willow Creek, which ran along the edge of town, about a quarter mile from the school. The creek wasn't deep, only about knee-high on a child in most places, but it was wide and clear, with smooth stones that were perfect for skipping across the water. It wound through a small wooded area before eventually joining the larger river that passed near the mine. Children often played there on weekends, building small dams with rocks and sticks, or catching minnows in jars to examine before releasing them back into the current. Mrs. Parker stood at the head of the line, her clipboard in hand as she checked off each child's name. "Remember, this is both a privilege and a learning opportunity," she told them, her voice carrying that mixture of warmth and authority that made her students both love and respect her. "I expect you all to behave as the young ladies and gentlemen I know you can be. Stay with your buddy," Mrs. Parker instructed, assigning each child a partner for the walk. The buddy system was non-negotiable with Mrs. Parker, who believed strongly in children looking out for one another. And remember, we're guests in nature's home. We observe, but we don't disturb. This was another of Mrs. Parker's firmly held beliefs, that nature was to be respected, not conquered or exploited. An unusual perspective in a town whose economy depended on extracting resources from the earth. The children nodded solemnly, understanding that the continuation of such treats depended on their good behavior. Then, as Mrs. Parker turned to lead them toward the school gate, their faces broke into barely contained grins of anticipation. An afternoon of freedom stretched before them, brightened by sunshine and the promise of discovery. The walk to Willow Creek took about 15 minutes. The children held hands with their buddies as they followed a narrow dirt path that wound through a stand of oak trees. Mrs. Parker led the way, occasionally stopping to point out interesting plants or bird nests. "Look there," she would say, pointing to a patch of wildflowers or a peculiar fungus growing on a fallen log. Nature's art gallery, free for all to enjoy. The children would gather around, momentarily still as they absorbed these small wonders before their natural energy propelled them forward again. The path to the creek was well worn by generations of children's feet. It passed first through the school's baseball field, then along the edge of Mr. Henderson's cow pasture, where Holstein cattle watched the procession of children with mild bovine interest, their tails swishing lazily at flies. Then came the stand of oak trees, their new spring leaves a tender green against the blue sky, still small enough to allow dappled sunlight to reach the forest floor where trilliums and May apples grew in abundance. As they walked, Mrs. Parker led them in a song, "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain," with its simple, repetitive chorus that even the shyest children joined by the second verse. Their young voices rose through the trees, startling a pair of cardinals that took flight in a flash of brilliant red. The song kept them together, matching their paces to its rhythm and reminding anyone who might be listening that these children were supervised, protected, safe. When they reached the creek, Mrs. Parker allowed them to remove their shoes and socks to wade in the cool water. My grandmother told my mother it was the highlight of the school year, a rare moment of freedom in their otherwise structured days. In 1950, children were expected to be seen and not heard, to sit still in class, to follow rules without question. But here, with their bare feet in the cold creek water and the sun warm on their shoulders, they could simply be children, experiencing the world through all their senses. The creek bed was lined with smooth stones in shades of gray, white, and rust red, polished by years of flowing water. Tiny fish darted between the children's ankles, and water striders skated across the surface tension in areas where the current was gentle. Dragonflies in electric blue and emerald green hovered above the water, their transparent wings catching the sunlight like stained glass. For about an hour, the children explored the creek bed, collecting interesting stones, catching tadpoles in jars they had brought, and competing to see who could skip a stone the furthest across the water's surface. Mrs. Parker sat on a large boulder, watching them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Later, some would remember this detail and wonder if she had somehow sensed what was coming, if some premonition had cast a shadow over her enjoyment of the beautiful day. From her perch on the boulder, Mrs. Parker maintained a careful count of her charges, her eyes constantly moving from one child to the next as they splashed and explored. 28 children, each with their own personality and needs, each ultimately her responsibility. She reminded Timmy Mitchell to stay within sight when he ventured too far upstream. She helped Susan Adams bandage a small cut on her toe from a sharp stone. She praised Robert Jenkins for his 5-skip stone throw, a new personal record that made his chest swell with pride. The children had divided themselves naturally into smaller groups based on interests and friendships. The more adventurous ones had gone farther upstream, turning over larger rocks to look for crayfish. The quieter ones sat in the shallows, constructing miniature boats from leaves and twigs to race down the current. A few of the girls had found a patch of wild violets growing near the water's edge, and were carefully weaving them into crowns and bracelets. It was Jimmy Caldwell who first noticed the change in the water. Jimmy, who would later become Milbrook's longest-serving mayor, was always observant. Even at 11 years old, he noticed details that others missed. He was upstream with the crayfish hunters when he saw the water begin to cloud with silt. Jimmy called out to Mrs. Parker, pointing at the creek where the water had suddenly turned cloudy, his young face already creased with concern. "It's probably just someone stirring up mud upstream," Mrs. Parker reassured him. But she stood up, her brow furrowed as she looked at the water. She shaded her eyes with one hand, looking upstream as if expecting to see other children, or perhaps a farmer's cattle that had wandered into the creek. But there was nothing visible that could explain the sudden change. The cloudy water was followed by a strange smell, metallic and sharp, like pennies left too long in a pocket, or the way the air smells just before a lightning strike. Several children wrinkled their noses, and a few backed away from the creek, sensing something was wrong before they could articulate what it was. The animal part of their brains, the ancient instinct that warns of danger before conscious thought can process it, was already urging caution. The smell grew stronger, and now the water was not just cloudy but discolored, taking on a rusty hue that reminded Mrs. Parker of the time her father had left a garden tool out in the rain and it had rusted overnight. She stood up straighter, her teacher's intuition telling her it was time to gather her students and return to the safety of the school. Then came the rumble. At first, they thought it was thunder, though the sky remained clear and blue. But the sound didn't fade like thunder would. Instead, it grew louder, a deep vibration that they could feel through the soles of their feet. It was as if the earth itself was groaning, a sound so fundamentally wrong that it silenced the children mid-laugh, mid-sentence, their young faces turning to Mrs. Parker for explanation, for reassurance. The birds had stopped singing, the insects had fallen silent. The world held its breath for one terrible moment as the rumbling grew to a roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Everyone out of the water now!" Mrs. Parker called, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the strange silence that had fallen over the natural world. "Put your shoes on quickly. We need to head back to school." She had already begun moving toward the creek, reaching for the nearest children, her instincts telling her to gather her flock close before the storm, whatever form it might take, broke upon them. The children sensed her urgency, if not the specific danger. Most began to splash toward the shore, reaching for shoes and socks discarded on the bank. But others hesitated, confused by the sudden shift in mood, still holding stones or jars with their aquatic treasures, reluctant to abandon their afternoon of freedom. Before all the children could reach the shore, the ground shook violently. It was not the gentle rolling of a distant earthquake, but a sudden, violent displacement, as if the earth had been struck by an enormous hammer. Trees swayed and several children lost their balance, falling into the creek or onto the muddy bank. Mrs. Parker grabbed the hands of the two nearest children and pulled them toward her, her knuckles white with the strength of her grip. The shaking continued, accompanied by cracking sounds as tree roots strained against the moving earth. A large oak at the edge of the creek tilted at an impossible angle before crashing down across the water, missing a group of children by mere feet. Screams mixed with the rumbling now, the children's fear adding a high human note to the bass roar of the earth. "The mine," someone whispered, and the words rippled through the group like a current. Everyone in Milbrook knew about mine collapses. They were rare, but when they happened, they were devastating. Every child had a father, uncle, or neighbor who worked underground. Every child had heard the whispered stories of cave-ins and gas leaks, of men trapped in darkness, of funerals with closed caskets. But this wasn't a mine collapse, at least not exactly. As they would later learn, one of the deeper shafts had breached an underground water source. The resulting flood had compromised the mine's structural integrity, causing sections to collapse and creating a chain reaction that altered the landscape above. The mine had been dug too deep, too greedily, without proper reinforcement. The company had cut corners to increase profits, and now the earth was extracting its revenge. The creek bank where they stood began to crack. Thin fissures appeared in the earth, spreading like spider webs. Mrs. Parker shouted for the children to move away from the water, to head for higher ground. Her voice cut through the chaos, providing direction when instinct alone might have led to panic. She had already begun herding the children who had reached the shore up the slight incline away from the creek. Most of the children obeyed immediately, scrambling up the gentle slope away from the creek. But some hesitated, confused by the sudden chaos, and a few were still in the water, trying to reach the shore as the current unexpectedly strengthened. The creek, which had been lazy and gentle just moments before, now moved with purpose, as if being pulled by an invisible force downstream. What happened next occurred so quickly that even those who witnessed it had trouble describing it later. The creek bed seemed to drop away, as if a giant had pulled a plug from beneath it. The water rushed into the newly formed depression, creating a powerful vortex. The children still in the creek were caught in the suddenly powerful current, their small bodies pulled toward the center of the swirling water. Their screams cut through the rumbling of the earth, high and terrified, the sound of childhood confronting mortality for the first time. Mrs. Parker ran toward the creek, reaching for a girl who was being pulled toward the center of the swirling water. The child, Mary Ellen Cooper, who had won the spelling bee earlier that month with the word perseverance, stretched her arms toward Mrs. Parker, her eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Parker managed to grab the child's hand, bracing her feet against a rock as she pulled. Another student, Billy Thompson, grabbed Mrs. Parker's waist to anchor her. Billy, tall for his age and strong from helping on his family's farm, dug his heels into the increasingly unstable ground and pulled with all his might. Through their combined efforts, they rescued Mary Ellen. She collapsed on the bank, coughing up creek water, her dress soaked and muddied, but alive. Mrs. Parker patted her back briefly, assuring herself that the child was breathing, before turning back to the creek where other children still struggled. Billy stayed with Mary Ellen, his arm around her shoulders as she sobbed. both of them watching as Mrs. Parker moved along the bank, reaching for another child. But as they turned to help the others, the ground beneath the creek gave way entirely. With a sound like the world ending, a roar that would echo in the survivors' nightmares for decades to come, the creek bed collapsed. The water disappeared into a gaping hole, and with it, several children who had been too close to the vortex. One moment they were there, reaching, screaming, fighting against the current. The next they were gone, swallowed by the earth along with the trees, rocks and water that had been part of their idyllic afternoon. The collapse expanded outward from the creek bed, the ground crumbling like a stale cookie. Mrs. Parker, still at the edge, trying to reach a boy who had grabbed onto an exposed tree root, felt the earth shift beneath her feet. She lunged backward just as the section of bank where she had been standing broke away and tumbled into the growing chasm. The boy's grip on the root failed, and he fell, his scream fading as he disappeared into the darkness below. The survivors stood in shocked silence, staring at where their friends had been just moments before. The rumbling had stopped. The world was suddenly terribly quiet. All that remained of Willow Creek was a gaping wound in the earth, irregular and jagged, as if some enormous beast had taken a bite out of the landscape and departed, satisfied. Mrs. Parker counted heads frantically, her face ashen, her hands shaking as she pointed at each child, mouthing numbers silently. 28 children had left the school after lunch. Only 14 remained on what was left of the creek bank. 14 children stared back at her with wide, shocked eyes, their young minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Their classmates, their friends, children they had shared lunch with less than 2 hours ago, were gone. The ground had stopped shaking, but Mrs. Parker knew they weren't safe yet. More collapses could follow. They needed help, and they needed it quickly. She looked at the group of surviving children, trying to determine who was the most capable of reaching town quickly. Her eyes settled on Tommy Wilson, a lanky boy known for his speed on the baseball field. "Run to town," she instructed the oldest boy, Tommy Wilson. Her voice was steady despite the horror she had just witnessed. "Tell them there's been an accident at Willow Creek. Tell them to bring ropes and ladders. Go." She squeezed his shoulder once, then gave him a gentle push in the direction of town. Tommy hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the chasm that had swallowed his friends, then turned and ran. Tommy ran as he'd never run before, his lungs burning as he sprinted the quarter-mile back to town. His mind was filled with images of his friends disappearing into the earth, their faces contorted in fear. He ran to outpace these images, to reach help before they could consume him completely. Branches scratched his face as he took a shortcut through the woods, but he barely noticed. His shoes, hastily put on without socks in the chaos at the creek, rubbed blisters on his heels, but the pain was distant, unimportant. He burst into the sheriff's office, gasping out his message before collapsing on the floor. Sheriff Davis was on the phone when Tommy entered, discussing some minor dispute between neighbors over a property line. He hung up immediately when he saw Tommy's face, white with shock, except for the thin scratches left by branches, his eyes wide and unseeing. "The creek!" Tommy managed between gasps for air. "It collapsed. Children, trapped. Mrs. Parker says, ropes, ladders." His message delivered, Tommy's body gave in to the exhaustion and shock. He slumped against the wall, his legs no longer able to support him. Sheriff Davis didn't waste time with questions. He triggered the town's emergency siren, a sound normally reserved for tornadoes or fires, and grabbed his hat and gun belt. He helped Tommy to a chair, told his deputy to give the boy water, and then ran out to his patrol car. The siren would bring men running to the fire station, where emergency equipment was stored. From there, he could direct a rescue operation. The alarm spread quickly through Milbrook. Men abandoned their work, grabbing whatever rescue equipment they could find. The mine whistle blew, signaling an emergency to the men working below ground. They emerged from the mine entrance like ants from a disturbed hill, blinking in the sunlight, their faces still black with coal dust as they listened to the frantic explanation from the foreman. Women gathered at the school, awaiting news and comforting each other. Some already knew their children were among the missing, having seen the empty classroom when they responded to the emergency siren. Others held on to hope, praying that their child had been among the lucky ones who stayed on solid ground. Children were sent home or kept inside, away from the unfolding tragedy. The town's doctor, Dr. Miller, prepared his clinic for possible injuries, sterilizing instruments and laying out bandages, his face grim as he imagined what might be coming through his door. Back at the creek, Mrs. Parker had moved the remaining children to safe ground and was trying to assess the situation. The hole where the creek had been was now about 30 feet across, a jagged wound in the earth. There was no way to tell how deep it went. Water still trickled in from upstream, disappearing into darkness. The edges continued to crumble occasionally, sending small cascades of dirt and pebbles into the void. Mrs. Parker had organized the children into a buddy system again, making sure that no one wandered too close to the edge in their shock and confusion. She had removed her cardigan and wrapped it around the shoulders of a small girl who couldn't stop shivering despite the warm day. She had wiped tears from faces, had hugged trembling bodies, had whispered reassurances that she wasn't entirely sure she believed herself. And through it all, she listened, because coming from the darkness below, they could hear voices, faint cries for help that tore at their hearts. Not all the missing children had been swallowed entirely by the earth. Some had landed on ledges or in small chambers created by the partial collapse. Some were still alive, still conscious, still calling for help with increasingly hoarse voices. Mrs. Parker called out reassurances, promising that help was coming, though her voice trembled with each word. She told them to stay still, to not try to climb or move around. She asked them to call out their names if they could, so she would know who was down there. A few voices responded, weak but clear enough to recognize: James Peterson, Susan Taylor, Michael Brown. Each name was a small victory, a spark of hope in the darkness. The rescue party arrived within 20 minutes, led by Sheriff Davis and Mr. Johnson, the mine foreman. They quickly secured ropes to nearby trees and lowered lanterns into the hole to assess the situation. Mr. Johnson, with 30 years of experience underground, directed the operation with calm efficiency. He had seen cave-ins before and knew that time was critical. The longer the children remained trapped, the less chance they had of survival. The men worked methodically, calling for quiet periodically so they could listen for voices from below. They brought more equipment from town: stronger ropes, a pulley system, blankets for the rescued children, and battery-powered lamps that could illuminate the darkness better than the oil lanterns they had initially brought. What they discovered was both a miracle and a nightmare. The collapse had created a series of ledges and smaller chambers about 15 feet below the surface. Most of the missing children had landed on these ledges rather than falling all the way to the bottom, which appeared to connect to the flooded mine shaft far below. They could see the children when they lowered the lamps, small, mud-covered figures huddled against the earthen walls, their faces turned up toward the light with expressions of desperate hope. But reaching them would be dangerous. The walls of the sinkhole were unstable, continuing to crumble in places, and the water level was rising as the underground flood sought new paths to the surface. Already, some of the children were standing in ankle-deep water that seemed to be rising by the inch. Time was running out in more ways than one. The strongest men volunteered to be lowered into the hole, secured by ropes held by those above. Mr. Johnson, who knew more about underground structures than anyone, went first, carrying extra rope to secure the children for the ascent. He was a large man with hands hardened by years of labor, but he moved with surprising gentleness as he reached the first ledge where 3 children huddled together, their arms wrapped around each other for warmth and comfort. "You're going to be all right now," he told them, his voice gruff but kind. "I'm going to tie this rope around you, one at a time, and the men up top are going to pull you up. You just hold on to the rope and try to use your feet against the wall to help yourself up. Can you do that for me?" The children nodded, their eyes wide in dirt-streaked faces. One by one, they began bringing children up from the darkness. Each rescue was met with cheers from above, but the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that others remained below, and time was running out. The water continued to rise, now knee-deep on the smallest child still trapped. The walls continued to shift and settle, sending showers of dirt and small rocks onto the rescuers and children alike. 7 children were rescued this way, each more frightened than the last, their clothes soaked and muddy, their eyes wide with terror. As they were brought up, they were wrapped in blankets and rushed to Dr. Miller's house, which had been converted into a temporary infirmary. There the doctor and his wife treated them for shock, cleaned and bandaged cuts and scrapes, and tried to coax details from them about the location of the others still trapped. But 7 children remained unaccounted for. Despite the rescuers' best efforts, they couldn't locate them in the accessible chambers. Mr. Johnson feared they had been swept deeper into the flooded mine system. If that was the case, the chances of finding them alive diminished with each passing minute. The water was cold, cold enough to cause hypothermia in a small child within an hour, and if they had been carried into the mine tunnels, they might already be beyond reach of the surface equipment. Mr. Johnson emerged from the hole, his face grim as he conferred with Sheriff Davis. "We need the mine rescue team," he said, wiping mud from his hands with a bandana. "And we need them fast. This is beyond what we can handle with what we have here." The sheriff nodded and dispatched a deputy to telephone the nearest mine rescue station, 30 miles away in Coopersville. As darkness fell, lanterns were set up around the sinkhole, casting long shadows that seemed to reach like fingers across the ground. The rescue effort continued through the night, with men working in shifts, exhaustion and desperation etched on their faces. The mine rescue team arrived with specialized equipment, oxygen tanks, communication devices, more powerful lights. They brought experience from other disasters, other collapses where children and men had been pulled alive from the Earth's grip. They worked through the night, methodically exploring every accessible part of the sinkhole and the connected mine tunnels. They called out names, listened for responses, and marked their progress on hastily drawn maps. The water continued to rise, forcing them to retreat from the lower levels. The air grew colder as night deepened, adding hypothermia to the list of dangers facing both the trapped children and the rescuers. By dawn, they had to accept the devastating truth. The remaining children could not be reached. The water had risen too high, the passages too unstable. To continue would risk the lives of the rescuers without any real hope of finding survivors. The mine rescue team leader, a veteran of a dozen similar operations, made the call that no one wanted to make but everyone knew was coming. The decision to end the search was made by Sheriff Davis, though it nearly broke him to do so. He had a daughter among the missing, little Sarah, who had wanted to be a nurse when she grew up, who had left for school that morning with her lunch pail and a ribbon in her hair, excited about picture day, who would never come home again. The sheriff stood before the gathered crowd, his hat in his hands, his voice thick with emotion as he announced that the rescue operation was now a recovery mission. The assembled parents and townspeople received his words in stunned silence, followed by wails of grief that echoed across the valley. The moment of hope was over. Now came the long, dark tunnel of mourning. Milbrook mourned as one. 28 children had smiled for a photograph that morning. Only 21 would ever smile again. 7 families would set empty places at their dinner tables that night and for many nights thereafter. 7 families would pack away school clothes and toys, preserving them as relics of lives cut short. 7 families would visit the cemetery on birthdays and holidays, placing flowers on small graves and wondering what might have been. The town came together in its grief, as small towns do. Neighbors brought food to the bereaved families. The church organized a memorial service where 28 candles were lit, 7 of which were extinguished during the service. A visual representation of the lives lost that left no dry eye in the congregation. The school closed for a week out of respect, and when it reopened, Mrs. Parker's class was moved to a different room because no one could bear to see the empty desks in the original classroom. In the days that followed, as the town tried to make sense of the tragedy, engineers from the state arrived to investigate. They brought drilling equipment, seismic sensors, and knowledge of geology that most of the townspeople lacked. They determined that decades of mining had created a honeycomb of tunnels beneath the seemingly solid ground. When the water breach occurred, it was only a matter of time before something collapsed. The men in suits pored over maps and diagrams, spoke in technical terms about subsidence zones and hydraulic pressure, and took samples of soil and rock back to their laboratories. They wrote reports filled with passive voice sentences that distributed blame so widely it seemed to disappear altogether. They made recommendations for future mining operations that would come too late for the 7 children of Milbrook. The mine company denied responsibility, claiming it was an act of God that could not have been predicted. But documents later revealed that they had been warned about possible water seepage in that area months before. The warnings had been ignored in favor of continued coal extraction. Profit had been prioritized over safety, as it often was in those days before stringent regulations and oversight. The families of the lost children filed lawsuits. Lawyers arrived from the city, briefcases bulging with precedents and strategies. The mine company settled out of court for sums that seemed enormous to the grieving families, but were mere fractions of the company's annual profits. Money changed hands, as if dollars could ever fill the void left by a child's laughter, a child's future. Milbrook was never the same after what became known simply as the Creek tragedy. The mine closed within a year, Unable to recover from the lawsuits and the exodus of workers who could no longer trust the ground beneath their feet, many families moved away, seeking distance from their grief. New families moved in, attracted by the cheap housing, unaware of the sorrow that permeated the soil of their new hometown. The physical landscape changed as well. Willow Creek found a new path, curving away from the site of the collapse. The sinkhole was filled in with truckloads of soil and rock, then fenced off as a precaution. Trees were planted to stabilize the ground and, perhaps, to hide the wound in the earth that had swallowed 7 young lives. Mrs. Parker resigned at the end of the school year. Some said she blamed herself for taking the children to the creek that day, though no one else in town held her responsible. She had done what teachers had done for generations, taken her students to learn from nature, to experience the world beyond classroom walls. She could not have known the danger that lurked beneath the peaceful creek. She left a letter for each of her remaining students, telling them how proud she was of their courage. Each letter was handwritten in her perfect cursive, each containing a personal message that recognized the individual child's strengths and dreams. The children kept these letters for decades, yellowed paper holding the words of a teacher who had shared both joy and tragedy with them. Then she disappeared from Milbrook, leaving no forwarding address. Rumors circulated about where she had gone. Some said back east to live with relatives. Others claimed she had entered a convent, dedicating her life to prayer for the souls of the lost children. A few insisted they had seen her in nearby towns, always alone, always distant, as if she carried a weight too heavy for casual interaction. The 14 children who had returned home that day formed a bond that would last their lifetimes. Every year on May 15th, they would gather at the new memorial that had been erected in the town square, a simple stone marker with 7 names and the words, "Forever Young." They would place flowers, share memories, and stand in silence for the friends they had lost. As they grew older, married, had children of their own, they kept this tradition alive, bringing their families to ensure that the story would be passed down through generations. My grandmother was one of those 14. She rarely spoke of that day, but she kept the class photograph, a reminder of friends lost and the fragility of life. When I asked my mother why Grandma had never told me this story herself, she said, "Some memories are too heavy to share." I understood then why my grandmother had wrapped the photograph so carefully, protecting it from light and time, but perhaps also protecting herself from the memories it evoked. I wonder sometimes about the lives the 7 lost children might have lived. Would James Peterson have become a doctor, as he once told my grandmother he wanted to be? Would Susan Taylor have moved to New York to study art, following her dream of painting landscapes that captured the beauty of the natural world? Would Michael Brown have taken over his father's hardware store, raising his own family in the house where he was born? 7 futures erased in an afternoon, 7 paths never taken. The site of the sinkhole was eventually filled in and fenced off. Nature reclaimed the area, with new trees growing where the creek had once flowed. Few people visit there now, though locals say that on warm spring days, when the wind blows just right, you can sometimes hear the sound of children laughing. Not the hollow, ghostly laughter of horror stories, but the genuine, joyful laughter of children at play, an echo of the last happy moments before tragedy struck. I took the photograph to Milbrook last week, curious to see if anyone might remember the event or recognize the faces staring back from across 7 decades. The town has shrunk to half its former size, but the memorial still stands in the square, albeit weathered by time. The names are harder to read now, the edges of the stone softened by 70 years of rain and snow and sunlight. The elderly man who runs the local historical society studied the photograph with trembling hands. "I haven't seen this in years," he whispered. "We thought all copies were lost." He was Billy Thompson, the boy who had helped Mrs. Parker save Mary Ellen Cooper at the creek, now 90 years old. He's the last survivor of the 14 who made it home that day. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at the photograph. "We were so young," he said, "so innocent. We thought we were invincible." His fingers traced the faces of the children who hadn't survived, his touch gentle, as if they might feel it across the divide of death and time. "I've never forgotten them. Not for a single day." He pointed to each face in the photo, reciting names without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting all these years for someone to ask. "We promised never to forget them," he told me, "and I never have." He told me stories about each of the lost children, how Robbie Jenkins could wiggle his ears, how Sarah Davis could spell words backward as quickly as forward, how Peter Martinez could draw horses that seemed ready to gallop off the page. In Billy's memories, the children lived on, preserved in the amber of recollection, forever 10 and 11 years old, forever on the cusp of lives they would never live. He spoke of them with such immediacy that it seemed they might walk through the door of the Historical Society at any moment, unchanged by the decades that had aged Billy into a bent old man with spotted hands and clouded eyes. Before I left Milbrook, Billy took me to the site of the old creek. The fence was rusted now, parts of it fallen away. Nature had completely reclaimed the area, with tall trees and thick underbrush hiding any evidence of the tragedy that had occurred there. Birds sang in the branches overhead, and wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, life continuing its cycle, oblivious to the history beneath the soil. "She still comes here, you know," Billy said quietly as we stood at the edge of the woods. "Who does?" I asked, though I had a feeling I knew the answer. "Mrs. Parker. But she'd be over 100 years old now," I said, "if she's even still alive." Billy smiled faintly. "I didn't say she was alive. I said she comes here, every May 15th, like clockwork, standing right where the creek used to be, calling out names like she's taking attendance." He didn't say this with fear or superstition, but with a simple acceptance that some bonds transcend death, that some responsibilities never end. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. But as we turned to leave, I felt a cool breeze against my face, carrying the faint scent of lilacs, the same flowers that had grown along the school fence in 1950. It was July now, long past lilac season, yet the scent was unmistakable, sweet and nostalgic and somehow sad. When I returned home, I placed my grandmother's photograph in a frame and set it on my desk. 28 children, frozen in time on a warm May day. 28 stories, some cut tragically short. 28 reminders that beneath the surface of ordinary days, extraordinary events wait to unfold. The photograph serves as both memorial and warning, a reminder that life is precious and precarious, that the ground beneath our feet is not always as solid as we believe. And sometimes, when I work late into the night, I could swear I hear the gentle sound of chalk on a blackboard and a woman's voice calling out names in alphabetical order, pausing after each one as if waiting for a response. Adams, Brown, Caldwell, Davis. The roll call continues, a ghostly echo of a classroom long disbanded, but it's only 14 names that ever answer, "Present, Mrs. Parker." The rest remain forever silent, forever young, forever captured in a class photograph taken on a spring day in 1950. Remember to like and subscribe to Shadow Frames for more untold stories from the past. Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced something inexplicable in your own hometown. Until next time, keep the shadows at bay with the light of knowledge.